The maître d' looked at me the way people look at a stray dog that wandered into a five-star hotel lobby. Not angry. Not threatening. Just confused. Like I'd made a wrong turn somewhere and hadn't realized it yet. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, keeping his voice low. "Professional. I don't see your name on the reservation list." I stood there in the entrance of Hargrove Hall, a place I'd driven past 100 times on Route 9 without ever thinking I'd set foot inside. Crystal chandeliers, black marble floors, waitstaff in white jackets moving between tables like they'd been choreographed. And somewhere in that room, my son was hosting a dinner I had written a check to pay for. "My name is Walter Marsh," I said. "My son is Derek Marsh. He's the one hosting tonight." The maître d' typed something into his tablet, tilted his head, typed again. "I apologize, Mr. Marsh. I've checked twice. Your name simply isn't here." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because I had known, somewhere deep in the part of a father that never stops hoping he's wrong, that something like this might happen. I just hadn't believed myself. "Let me tell you about my hands. I've been asked about them before at the hardware store, at church, at my granddaughter's school play when I shook her teacher's hand and she looked down like I'd handed her something unexpected. My hands are the hands of a man who spent 40 years pulling wire through conduit, climbing into attics in July heat, crawling under houses in January mud. I built my own house in Claremont when I was 34 years old, every stud and rafter. The electrical panel I wired myself and signed off on with a pride I never could explain to anyone who hadn't done the same. My hands are rough and wide and permanently darkened in the creases, the kind of hands no manicure ever fully corrects. I stopped trying to correct them years ago. My wife, Sandra, used to hold those hands when we sat on the porch in the evenings. She'd trace the calluses with her thumb like she was reading something written there, some story only she understood. She passed 6 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. There are days I still reach for her in the morning before I remember. My son was 7 years old when I started teaching him the trade. Not because I wanted him to become an electrician, I wanted him to become a man who understood how things worked, who wasn't afraid of hard labor, who knew the satisfaction of fixing something broken. Derek was sharp, sharper than me, honestly, and I never had trouble admitting that. He got a scholarship to state, then a master's in business administration from a school in Virginia, whose name I learned to pronounce correctly because it mattered to him. He went into real estate development. By the time he was 35, he had his own firm, Marsh Capital Group, and an office downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and a receptionist who called me Mr. Marsh Sr. the one time I visited. That visit was 3 years ago. His daughter-in-law, Claire, had decorated the office herself. She was pleasant to me in the way that certain people are pleasant to those they consider beneath them. Warm in tone, cold in substance. She called me Walter when she remembered, and Derek's dad when she didn't. I noticed she introduced me to their friends as Derek's father from Claremont, with a particular emphasis on from Claremont, as though the town itself explained everything that needed explaining about me. I'm not a bitter man. I want to be clear about that before I go any further. I raised my son to reach for more than I had, and he did. I don't resent the success. I don't resent the nice house in Whitfield Estates, the private school my grandson attends, the vacations I hear about secondhand. What I resent, and I'll be honest about this, is the slow and deliberate erasure. The way a man can be edited out of his own family's story while still being alive to watch it happen. It started small, the way these things always do. A Christmas dinner where I was seated at the end of the table with the Coates. A birthday call that came 2 days late with an excuse about a conference. My grandson Tyler's school plays, the ones where I used to sit in the front row, gradually moved to rows I wasn't informed about until the program was already printed. Last Thanksgiving, I drove 40 minutes to Derek's house and found a note on the door saying they'd changed plans and gone to Claire's parents' place in Asheville. No call, just a note. I sat in my truck in their driveway for about 10 minutes before I drove home and ate a turkey sandwich by myself. But I kept showing up. That's what fathers do. 8 months ago, my son called me on a Tuesday night, which was unusual because Derek typically communicated through texts, short ones, the kind that answered questions but never asked them. He sounded relaxed, almost warm, the way he used to sound. before everything became about appearances and optics, and whatever word they were using that week for the performance of a life. He told me about the dinner. Marsh Capital Group was celebrating its 10th year in business. He was hosting a formal dinner at Hargrove Hall, 40 guests, investors and partners, and people he called the right people to have in the room. He was proud. I could hear it under the practiced professional tone. The boy who used to show me his report cards still surfacing through the CEO. Then he paused and said he needed a favor. The venue deposit was $15,000. He'd had a liquidity issue, the word he used, with a deal that had closed slower than expected. He needed the deposit covered within the week, or he'd lose the reservation. He'd pay me back within 30 days, he said. He had the cash flow, it was just timing. I didn't hesitate. I went to my bank the next morning, transferred the money, and sent him the confirmation. He texted back, "Thanks, Dad. Means a lot." 4 words. I saved them. I'm not ashamed to say I read them more than once. I picked out a suit. Sandra had always said I looked like a man in charge when I wore the charcoal gray one with the white shirt, and I believed her because she'd always told me the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. I had it dry cleaned. I bought a new tie, navy blue, simple pattern from the department store on Elm. I polished my shoes with the same care I gave to tools that mattered. I didn't tell Derek I was planning to come. I wanted to surprise him. I wanted to stand in that room among his colleagues and feel, just once, what it looked like from the outside, my son's success, the life he'd built. I drove to Hargrove Hall on a Thursday evening in late October, parked my truck between a Mercedes and a BMW, and didn't let myself feel anything about that, and walked to the entrance with my back straight. You already know what happened at the door. The maître d' was apologetic in the professional way, which is the coldest kind of apologetic there is. He offered to call someone from the event. I told him yes, please do. He made a quiet call, and within 3 minutes, my son appeared at the entrance. Derek was in a black tuxedo. His hair was cut close on the sides, neat and deliberate. He looked like the cover of a magazine about wealth that I would never subscribe to. For just a moment, before he saw me, I felt the pure, uncomplicated pride of a father. This man came from me, from my house, from the hands that taught him how to flip a breaker and read a blueprint. Then he saw me, and his face did something I had never seen it do before. It wasn't surprise. It was closer to something being calculated. Very fast. Behind his eyes. "Dad," he said. He said it quietly. "Hey, son." I said it the way I'd always said it. Easy. Warm. The way you greet someone whose presence in the world has always been a comfort to you. He stepped closer and lowered his voice. "I didn't know you were coming. Thought I'd surprise you. Proud of you, Derek. Wanted to be here." He glanced back through the glass doors. I could see the tables from where I stood. White linens, candles, people in expensive clothes talking to other people in expensive clothes. His world. "Dad," he said again. Differently this time. "Tonight's it's a very specific kind of event. These are clients, investors. It's not really a family situation." I looked at him for a moment. "You said means a lot," I said. When I sent the 15,000, something moved across his face that might have been shame if he'd allowed it to complete itself. Instead, it settled into the particular expression of a man managing a problem. "I'll pay you back. I told you that. But tonight isn't," he paused. "I just don't think it's the right setting for your father." He didn't answer. And in that silence was everything I needed to know about who we had become to each other. I'm 64 years old. I've buried my wife. I've pulled wire in 100-degree attics and spent nights in hospital waiting rooms and sat at my kitchen table alone on enough holidays to know what alone actually feels like. I have, in my life, been afraid. But standing at the entrance of Hargrove Hall on a Thursday in October, I was not afraid. I was something quieter and heavier than afraid. "All right," I said. I turned around and walked back to my truck. I sat there in the parking lot for a while, not crying, though the honest version of this story acknowledges I came close. Just sitting. Just being a man who had driven 40 minutes in a dry-cleaned suit to be turned away at a door by his own son. The Mercedes beside me caught the light from the hall entrance and threw it back in shapes across my dashboard. I watched those shapes for a while. Then I did something I hadn't planned on doing. I called Martin Cook. Martin and I had worked together for nearly 20 years. He'd started as a contractor I brought in on commercial jobs and became, over time, one of the closest friends I've had since Sandra passed. He'd retired from construction the same year I did, but unlike me, Martin had invested carefully for decades commercial properties, a self-storage chain, some real estate partnerships I'd never fully understood. He wasn't flashy about it. He drove a Ford F-150 and wore flannel shirts and would help you move a refrigerator on a Saturday without being asked. But Martin Cook was, by any financial measure, a wealthy man. More to the point, Martin Cook was one of the 40 guests invited to my son's dinner tonight. I hadn't known that until 3 weeks ago, when Martin mentioned offhand that he'd received an invitation from a development firm, whose name he almost got right before I told him it was my son's company. Martin had laughed and said, what a small world it was. I'd felt proud, in the uncomplicated way. Now I sat in the parking lot and called him. He picked up on the second ring. The background noise told me he was already inside. Walt, he said. Where are you? Parking lot, I said. A pause. Why are you in the parking lot? I told him. I kept it brief. I've never been a man who needed to perform his own pain for an audience. Martin didn't say much while I talked. When I finished, there was a silence on the line that I recognized as a man deciding something. Stay put, he said. Martin, you don't have to. I said, stay put, Walt. Give me 15 minutes. I stayed put. I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, the same hands that built a house, the same hands that held my wife, the same hands that wrote a check for $15,000 because my son said it meant a lot. 11 minutes later, my phone rang. Martin's name on the screen. Come inside, he said. Martin, Walt. His voice was the voice of a man who was not making a suggestion. Come inside. I straightened my tie in the rearview mirror. I looked at myself for a moment, 64 years old, gray at the temples, lines around my eyes that told the true story of my life more honestly than any words I could choose. I looked like what I was, and what I was, I decided, was enough. The maître d' recognized me when I walked back in. Before he could speak, a hand appeared at my shoulder, and Martin was beside me, tall and solid in a suit I'd never seen him wear before. He's with me, Martin said pleasantly. The maître d' nodded like that was the most natural thing in the world. The room was exactly as I'd seen it from the glass doors, except now I was inside it. 40 people in a room designed to make you feel the weight of old money, which is a different weight than earned money, heavier in the wrong places, lighter where it counts. I spotted my son across the room. He was mid-conversation, relaxed, a glass of something amber in his hand. Claire was beside him in a red dress, touching his arm the way she touched it when she wanted him to know she was watching. Derek saw me about 3 seconds later. I watched the sequence of expressions cross his face. Confusion, then recognition, then something fast and defensive that he tried to pack away before anyone noticed. He excused himself from his conversation and moved toward me. Martin met him halfway. Derek, Martin said, with the particular warmth of a man who is going to be genuinely kind about something unpleasant. Your father almost didn't make it in. Lucky I found him. Derek looked at me over Martin's shoulder. I didn't help him. I had spent a long time helping my son, and right now I wanted to see what he would do without my help. Martin, Derek said carefully, I wasn't aware my father. He wrote you a $15,000 check for this room, Martin said, still pleasant, still warm, the way a good man delivers a fact without making it a weapon. I'd say that earns a seat at the table. Something shifted in the air between the three of us. I saw Claire register it from across the room and begin moving toward us. Of course, Derek said, quietly. Of course, he should be here. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And I saw the thing he'd been managing all evening finally get too large to manage. Not in front of the clients. Not here where the wrong impression might form. But there it was anyway. Moving behind his eyes, the boy who used to show me his report cards, the kid who fell asleep in my truck on the way back from job sites with sawdust in his hair. We found a table. I sat beside Martin, Claire arrived and greeted me with a precision that I recognized as the social equivalent of a controlled detonation. All surface warmth, nothing underneath. I said hello. I was polite. I have never needed anyone to know I won something for the winning to have happened. Midway through dinner, Martin stood to give remarks. He was being recognized as one of Marsh Capital Group's early investing partners, a relationship that had, according to the program, yielded substantial returns. Martin spoke the way he always spoke, plainly, without theater. Then he paused and turned slightly toward where I was sitting. Before I close, Martin said, I want to mention something that most of you in this room won't know. He let the room settle. About 30 years ago, I was a contractor starting out in this county. I was overextended, underfunded, and about 3 weeks from losing my first real job. An electrician named Marsh spent 2 weekends helping me rewire a commercial property at cost because he believed I'd pay him back when I could. He didn't make me sign anything. He didn't put conditions on it. He just helped. Martin looked at me directly. Walt is here tonight. And a lot of what you're celebrating in this room started with the kind of man he is. The room applauded. I looked at my hands on the tablecloth. I couldn't look up right away, and I wasn't going to apologize for that. Beside me, I felt, rather than saw, my son become very still. After the applause faded, and Martin sat down, and the dinner moved back into its rhythms, Derek reached across and put his hand over mine on the table. He didn't say anything. He was 41 years old, and he was still, underneath everything, my son. And we had never been a family that needed to use many words for the things that mattered most. I turned my hand over and gripped his once, the way I used to grip his hand when he was small and the world felt too large. Then I let go and picked up my water glass. The dinner went on. Derek introduced me to 3 people he called partners, and he introduced me as his father, Walter Marsh, who built his own house and taught him everything he knew about working with what you have. I don't know what it cost him to say that. I don't know, and I stopped trying to calculate it sometime around the appetizers. Claire found me near the end of the evening. She came to stand beside me with her own glass of wine, and for a moment, we both looked out at the room without speaking. I didn't know Martin knew you, she said finally. A long time, I said. She nodded slowly. She was a smart woman. She understood what the evening had become and what it meant without needing it drawn out. Derek talks about you more than you probably know, she said. It sounded like it might actually be true. That's good, I said. I drove home at 10:30 on Route 9, the same road I'd driven 1,000 times. Past the lumber yard, and the auto parts store, and the diner where Sandra and I used to get pie on Sunday mornings. My suit was still clean. My tie was still straight. The radio played something I half recognized, an older song, the kind that arrives in the car late at night when you're tired and haven't raised your guard against being moved by things. I thought about my father, who was a pipe fitter in Ohio and never owned anything nicer than a Chevrolet and died with the same rough hands I inherited. I thought about Sandra reading those hands on the porch. I thought about Derek at 7 years old standing in the shell of the house I was building, looking up at the roof joists with his mouth open like the building was magic. It was magic. The whole thing, the building and the raising and the letting go and the being left behind and the being found again. All of it. Magic. I got home and changed out of the suit and hung it carefully. I made a cup of coffee I probably didn't need and sat at the kitchen table under the light. I'd installed myself 40 years ago in a house I built with my own hands, and I felt the specific peace of a man who knows exactly who he is. My phone buzzed at 11:15. A text from Derek. I'm sorry, Dad. I mean that. I'll call tomorrow. I read it once. Then I set the phone down and finished my coffee. There is a thing about getting older that no one warns you about adequately, the way you stop needing people to understand you and start being enough of a witness to yourself. I had been ashamed of nothing my entire life. Not the truck in the parking lot next to the Mercedes. Not the calloused hands on the white tablecloth. Not the flannel shirts, or the work boots, or the county I came from. I had worked for 64 years, and I was still here, and I had raised a son who, somewhere beneath everything that wealth and ambition had built on top of him, still remembered who taught him to read a blueprint. That would have to be enough. And mostly, it was. The next morning, Derek called at 8:30, which told me he'd been up before that, sitting with what he needed to say the way you sit with something heavy before you can pick it up. I made fresh coffee and sat in the same chair and answered on the second ring. He talked for a while. I listened in the way I'd always listened to him fully, without rehearsing my response while he spoke. He said he'd been afraid that his world would look smaller with me in it. He said he understood now that it looked larger. He said some things about his mother that surprised me with their tenderness, and some things about himself that cost him something to say. I let him say all of them. When he finished, I said, "I know, son." "That's it?" he said. "What else do you need?" A pause. Then a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been the other thing. Or both. "I don't know," he said. "I'll come up Sunday," I said. "We'll have dinner. I'll bring the pie." "Yeah," he said. "Yeah. Okay. That sounds right." I hung up and poured a second cup of coffee and looked out the window at the yard I'd maintained for 30 years, at the garden Sandra had planted and I had continued, at the oak tree in the corner that I'd climbed as a boy before there was a house here and that my son had climbed after. Some things you build stay standing. Some things you plant keep growing long after you've stopped tending them. I had learned, over the course of a long and honest life, that this was as close to permanence as anything gets. My hands wrapped around the mug. The coffee was good. The morning was quiet. Outside, the oak tree was doing what oak trees do in October, turning slow and certain and unapologetically itself, letting the light catch it in colors that had no reason to be so beautiful, except that they were. I sat with that for a while. It was enough. It was more than enough.